Perfect. I would now just carry on with a little bit more housekeeping. I would ask you all to please mute your microphones. And again, I would ask panel members and guests to please notify us, the Caribbean Links team, of any gate crashes and/or inappropriate behavior so that gate crashers and anyone behaving inappropriately will be removed. Our social media information will be available in the Zoom group chat. We are at Links Caribbean on both Instagram and Twitter. We out here. So you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And we would very much appreciate you following us. With all that being said, I am now going to introduce Dr. Thera Edwards, and I will read out her bio. Dr. Edwards is map curator and lecturer in the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Jamaica. Her interdisciplinary research includes landscape change and history, geomorphology, climate change responses, vegetation ecology and archaeology, historical maps, aerial photographs, satellite imagery, and geographical information systems, GIS, are key components of her research and analyses. In the past 20 years, her work has focused on environmental management and sustainable development, with particular emphasis on biodiversity, forestry, watersheds, agriculture, and protected areas management. Thera has written and co-authored technical reports and papers for several development agencies, as well as for presentation at conferences and symposia. In 2016, she co-edited the volume Global Change and the Caribbean, Adaptation and Resilience, along with David Barker, Duncan McGregor, and Kevon Riney. Wow, absolutely amazing. With all that being said, please put your hands together and give a warm Caribbean Links clap and welcome for Dr. Thera Edwards.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with the Caribbean Links family, all the way from Jamaica, where it's a little bit warmer than I think where most persons are connecting from. And so it is an absolute delight and pleasure to share with you about climate change. And even though I'm a little bit removed from where you are, or most of you are in the UK, we're all connected in the sense that climate change is affecting everyone. And so I'd just like to say that climate change is something that we all should be concerned about, because what happens in one place actually drives the global climate, and certainly regional and country-specific climates. I'm actually currently part of a project called Recipes for Resilience, which is a partnership between some researchers at the University of the West Indies and the University of Edinburgh. And we are looking at climate change and climate justice through food. And we're actually engaging youth in the UK and across the Caribbean through the Caribbean Youth Environment Network to talk about climate change and how food actually is a big part of what happens with climate change and global food systems. Just saying that by way of, you know, the interconnections are many and varied. I've actually have a brief a presentation to share with you all, so I'm just going to cue that up. Afia, I need to have my screen sharing re-enabled, please. I think that went, but not a problem. So when that's up, then I can go ahead and share. So the way I've structured my talk this afternoon is basically to look at climate change. I think we have a fair idea about what it is. So I won't get too much into definitions, but more to hone in on why it's important in the Caribbean, and to look at not just to have a broad brush look at the Caribbean, but more to talk about Jamaica, where I'm based, Also, we have, you know, another presenter, Christine, who will, of course, you know, give a more direct presentation to her own context. So here goes. So I would just, again, just say that here we are. And the Caribbean, as you're aware, yes, we have some mainland countries like Suriname, Ghana, and Belize, but it's mostly comprised of small island developing states. And as such, we have to be very much more in tune with climate change and its impacts, because our natural assets in the islands, you know, the forests, the beaches, the marine resources, the built environment is largely based in the coastal areas. Our livelihoods are tied to the land. You know, we don't have a lot of industries here. So things like agriculture, tourism are our mainstays of income. We also have agricultural industries, which are not only provided income, but contributing to our own domestic food security. And of course, we have fisheries where we are getting marine animals. We also might be harvesting seaweeds and so on. So it's all linked into food security. So the islands have low-lying coastal areas which are very vulnerable to climate change, things such as erosion of beaches, erosion of coastlines, sea level rise. We have a lot of concentration of the populations in the coastal areas, because some islands, and I'll just give examples, have mountainous interiors. You have places like Dominica, St. Lucia, Grenada, Jamaica, where we do have some settlement in the mountains, but we may have forest reserves. And just because of accessibility, the coastal areas is where we have the human settlements. As I've said before, we have very restricted economies, which are highly dependent on tourism, agriculture, and a few mineral resources quarrying. We have very climate sensitive ecosystems. So, you know, when it gets to summer and we have the sea surface temperatures increasing and we begin to have these storms that are beginning to spin off the coast of Africa, we get into our active hurricane season. We are, because of where we are located on our latitude, at risk from extreme events. You know, we have, you know, high intensity meteorological events which dump huge amounts of rainfall. We have tropical storms, we have hurricanes. And of course, there is the risk, you know, thrown in, not necessarily climate related, but it will be a compounding effect when you have things such as earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. From a human resource point of view, there is extremely low availability of technical and human resources. We're not uneducated, we have some of the world's best minds coming from the region. But in terms of absolute numbers, there is a resource constraint. We also suffer from brain drain in the region. And so sometimes a lot of what needs to happen in terms of technical activities, we simply just don't have persons to do it, or it's the same persons doing everything. Some islands rely very heavily on external consultants. And I say this because I've done a fair amount of environmental and work around the region. And many islands, for things that, say, a larger island like Jamaica would be able to handle within our government agencies, they are actually advertising for consultants to write national reports. So they're signatories to international conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But when their reports are due under these climate agreements, they have to actually bring in persons to do them because they do not have the capacity locally. So that's something to be mindful of. So some of what I've mentioned in all of that Here are some pictures from my various ganders around the region. So here we have Suriname. They have some real problems in the coastal areas of just outside their capital of Paramaribo, where they have to build, they've been building this massive coastal wall, not quite on the scale of the Great Wall of China, but this extensive wall trying to prevent intrusion of the sea. You find, like on the picture at the bottom right, they're building houses on pillars because of the ever-present threat of flooding. So they are now in adaptation/resilience mode, and more about that later. You have Dominica, where you have they have various effects. So here we have an aquaculture setup on the island of Dominica. You also have, this is their fisheries complex, and you notice there's a heavy wall between the sea and where the boats are brought in. And you also have these tetragonal ripraps, which are used to protect coastal areas. So the boats are behind this in terms of being washed out to sea, providing protection from high waves during storm surge events. And on the bottom right, here's a picture of post-flooding. You see the high water levels, and what is here is actually silt that has been washed down from the mountain areas during the high intensity rainfall event. Here we have St. Kitts, more of the same. Bottom left, you see the pile of large boulders at the coast area, trying to protect the fragile coastline from the force of wave events and erosion. And again, here we have the same thing, another set of these man-made artificial structures that they're putting in to, again, to break up the energy of waves from storm surge events. So another image. Now we talk about our tourism product, we talk about fisheries. The other thing that's emerging, a lot of people might be aware of, it's getting hotter. So the temperatures, the global temperatures are increasing. And of course, we talk about more frequent events, but these hotter sea temperatures actually have an implication for our coral reefs, which provide scuba activities for tourists. The reefs also are part of our reef fisheries. They're part of many interconnected ecosystems. So you have what's known as coral bleaching, and corals can be as very sensitive to as little as a 1 degree Celsius change in temperature over what we call their threshold temperature can lead to bleaching events. And the region has had some severe mass bleaching events. The other thing that happens too with the sea temperatures changing and solution of gases is what we call acidification, ocean acidification. And when the oceans get more acidic, because calcium carbonate is in the coral reef system, is sensitive to the acid conditions, you get weakening of our reef systems. You then have a storm event, the reef is weakened, the reef can break apart. The reefs provide coastal shore protection, which then gets compromised, and then you have coastal areas being at risk. So this is some of what's happening. I've chosen to focus on tourism because that is where most of the islands get their income. So if you have warmer temperatures, the impact on the tourism industry, we're looking at things such as altered seasonality, heat stress for tourists, cooling costs in hotels, increased mosquitoes. We can have more, with increased mosquitoes, you have risk of mosquito-borne diseases like dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and so on. We can have increasing frequency and intensity of extreme storms. You think of persons, who are visiting, being trapped after a storm, can't get off the island, or persons being averse to traveling when they feel that this could be a problem. Increased insurance costs, a big deal. Business interruption. We have things such as reduced rainfall, which we get water shortages, competition between tourism and other sectors. We get wildfires, which threaten the islands. Then we have the flip of that, where we have the heavy precipitation events leading to flooding damage, which can affect historical places, cultural assets, river flows. We have sea level rise, which leads to coastal erosion, loss of beach area, higher costs. I showed some of the concrete structures to protect coastal areas, maintain waterfronts and sea defenses. The sea surface temperatures, the coral bleaching, and of course the impacts on the dive and snorkel destinations, fisheries. More frequent and larger forest fires. We get problems from the ecotourism attractions that might be in forest areas. We have soil changes, moisture levels, erosion, acidity. That can also have impacts on agriculture. And of course, there's an impact on biodiversity. Now, it's not to say that we're aware, but there's been no action. We've had action from as far back as 1992, when the region started put its support behind the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC as it's commonly known. We've had the 1994 Global Conference on Sustainable Development held in Barbados, which led to the Barbados Program of Action, which had a lot of statements and actions prescribed for climate change. In 1997 to 2001, we had a World Bank Organization of American States CARICOM project, the Caribbean Planning for Adaptation to Climate Change, CPAC project. And coming out of that was a decision to form a climate change center. And later that year, the Articles of Association for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the 5 Cs Center, were laid down. And in 2009, we had the CARICOM Heads of Government approval for the regional framework for achieving development resilient to climate change. So we know in the region there's climate change. There has been action, both institutional, programmatic, project, and of course, trickling down to national action. The 5C Center provides information. It does climate modeling with the support of the University of the West Indies Climate Studies Group. There is the assistance to member states in project development and project implementation, and of course, training. I've talked a little bit about, I wanted to focus that a lot of early action was on adaptation. How are we going to adapt to this changing situation? So we have had the Caribbean Fish Sanctuary Partnership Initiative. They've looked at monitoring and enforcement of marine protected areas. They've had targeted action in Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. And they've been looking a lot about public awareness of environmental, social, and economic benefits from things such as marine protected areas and fish sanctuaries around the region. For Jamaica, our actions have started from 1994 with that framework convention. We became a party in 1995. We adopted the Kyoto Protocol in 97. And we've had a number of landmark things such as setting up a wind farm in 2004 to help with our energy generation. In 2013, we established a climate change division within the ministry responsible for climate change. We've, back in 2011, to step back in time, we had a pilot program for climate resilience strategy. 2015, the Paris Agreement, and we're coming right through to 2019 when we got into climate financing and carbon pricing track initiatives with France and Qatar at the UN Climate Finance Summit. So we're looking at things such as how to do carbon trading through REDD+ and other mechanisms related to climate financing and making our resources like our forests actually earn money for us through climate financing mechanisms. Just in 2019, it's the 2019 report, but it was done in 2020. There was a State of the Jamaica Climate Report, and that report looked at 5 key sectors: water, health, tourism, agriculture, and coastal resources and human settlements. So that report looked at things such as water for Kingston, looking at where we have our sources of water, the watersheds, population. It looked at coastal monitoring for key coastal areas such as the Palisades, where or one of our international airports is. It looked at mangroves because we're heavily on natural protection systems. And for the agricultural sector, they were looking at things such as computerized systems, models for crop data management to predict yields, looking at varying climate conditions, and to go into climate smart agriculture. So they developed the decision support system for agrotechnology transfer, which has everything from major crops such as legumes, cereals, root crops, oil crops, vegetables, and so on. Conscious that I'm getting to the end of my time. So we know that this kind of climate reporting, modeling, planning is important because we recognize that our rainfall patterns are trending down over time in, say, the major watersheds for Kingston, which has, you know, a population of almost 2 million. We recognize that these events such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, that every time we have one of them, our agricultural production drops below our standard agricultural production index. In the times when we don't have these events, we actually rise above our average production. So it is important that we are mindful of these things. There are a number of things such as the Caribbean Agricultural Meteorological Initiative, looking at linking farmers to information systems that can come directly to their phones. Drought forecasting is a part of that. So I can share some of these links later in the chat. So we're looking at a shift from adaptation. So we're having the more frequent events. We're not just needing to adapt. We have to now learn how to bounce back and become resilient. And the last part of my presentation looks at an organization, the Caribbean Coastal Area Management Foundation, which is based in southern Jamaica. It's Jamaica's largest protected area. It has both marine and land-based areas within the protected area. CCAM and the Portland Bight area is very special because it has forests, dry forests, it has mangroves, wetlands, it has special fisheries conservation areas, popularly known as fish sanctuaries. It has a Ramsar site, it's a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, it's so many things. But that NGO, which I chair the board of, has been looking at capacity building for climate change resilience and environmental protection. They've been looking at things such as the effectiveness of the management of the area in terms of their context, their planning, the inputs available, processes, outputs, and outcomes using the management effectiveness tracking tool MET. They've been looking at improvement of marine resources through reef restoration, their public education, partnership with fisher folk, disaster planning is a big part of CCAM's work. And of course, if we're telling people that we are designating fish sanctuaries, please don't fish in these areas, please change your mesh size to catch larger fish, and all these other livelihood altering recommendations, we have to, of course, provide alternate livelihoods. So we're looking at things such as community-based tourism, in the area with training and actual eco tours that we are implementing or about to implement, having gotten all the necessary government approvals. And of course, they are a part of the National Special Fisheries Conservation Area Network, where they meet with other NGOs looking, and the government through the Fisheries Authority, to protect the fisheries of the island. So thank you. That's my contribution to tonight's discussion, or this evening's discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thera. Can we all please give a huge warm Caribbean Links clap to thank Dr. Thera Edwards for her time this afternoon. That was a thoroughly interesting presentation. And thank you so much for talking so much about how we are moving from adaptation to resilience, and just again solidifying how climate change affects everyone. And I really enjoyed how you went into detail explaining how what happens, for example, with coral reefs is part of many interconnected ecosystems. So what affects one thing will affect other areas of development in the Caribbean, and flora and fauna, of course, are very much interconnected. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thank you very much, Dr. Thera. Thank you for your time. I'm now going to introduce Christine Samwaru, who is the founder of the Breadfruit Collective, and I am going to read out her bio. Christine Samwaru was born and raised in Guyana. She moved to New York City in 2008. During that time, she studied at Iona College and the New School. Christine focused her studies on climate justice and sustainability in Guyana and the Caribbean. She has a master's degree in environmental policy and sustainability management. In New York City, she worked as an educator at the Climate Museum and the Green Girls program under City Parks Foundation. In 2018, Christine decided to move back to Guyana to follow her dreams of doing environmental work in her country. She worked as a senior environmental officer at the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Currently, she is the co-coordinator with Women for Biodiversity, an international NGO that works to mainstream gender within the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Christine is the founder of the Breadfruit Collective, an emerging NGO which aims to work at the intersection of gender and environmental justice. The work of the Breadfruit Collective aims to be intersectional, inclusive, and intergenerational. Christine is a Climate Reality Project Fellow. Christine describes the mission behind the Breadfruit Collective as being work that is related to her history, passion, and a way to honor her grandmother and women in her family who experience various forms of gender-based violence. Wow. Can we all please give a huge warm Caribbean Links welcome for the amazing Christine Samwaru.
Thank you so much, Afia. That's so nice of you.
I will start sharing the screen now. So just
okay, great.
One moment.
Okay, so I guess I can start a brief introduction. Good afternoon. I'm going to say good afternoon, but also good evening to many of you who are joining. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to say thank you to Caribbean Links and specifically to Afia for reaching out to me. We have been in conversation since December, so I know this is a topic that she's really interested in, and she's really interested in getting Caribbean perspective. And that's something that I really appreciate. I really appreciate when organizations are centering people that the issues affect the most. So I'm having some technical difficulties with my internet. So while I'm presenting, just to make sure everything flows smoothly, I'm gonna take myself off the camera and then I'll come back on. So Afia, I just wanna confirm that you're hearing me okay?
Yes, Christine, we're hearing you well.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I really appreciate your presentation because you set up the stage perfectly well. In regards to climate change in the region. As many of you are aware, we are small countries and small islands, small developing islands, and we're very, very vulnerable to climate change impacts. In Guyana specifically, we are a coastal country. 90% of our population live along the coast. So when it comes to climate disasters, specifically flooding, Guyanese, this has become like a norm, so to speak, and it shouldn't, because it's kind of these disasters happen and they do affect livelihood. With that being said, my presentation is going to focus specifically on the gender aspect, like talking about climate change, but using a gender lens. So as Afia said, I'm the founder of the Breadfruit Collective, which is an emerging organization in Guyana that centers women, girls, so gender and environmental justice at the backdrop of environmental conservation and environmental justice very broadly. When I speak of climate change and climate justice, I speak of it broadly in the sense of social justice, because we know, and as Dr. Edwards mentioned, climate change is something that affects all of us. However, not all of us are affected by it equally. So climate justice do have a connection to racial justice, immigrant justice, and today I'm going to focus on gender. So in Guyana, we are known for some very high statistics that are a little bit negative, so to speak. And I guess the work that I try to do in Guyana, I hope that in the future, I can live in a country whereby we're not known for these high statistics. Currently, 1 in every 2 women in Guyana will experience intimate partner violence. And the Gender Inequality Index currently ranks Guyana at 122 out of 154 countries. Next slide, please. Climate change is a feminist issue because women make up the majority of the world's poor. In many places, women do not own the land. Women are responsible for agricultural work and food production. This increases their personal and economic vulnerability to lost harvests, which result in change in temperature, floods, and droughts. In many sectors of our economy as well, women aren't counted within that sector. For example, if we're talking about fisheries, there are a lot of women who are involved in the sector, but maybe they may not be the ones that are going out at sea catching the fish. They might be the ones selling it. But a lot of times women aren't being counted. And when we are reporting in our national reports, again, they're not being reflected, or issues affecting them aren't being reflected in these reports. Women often have less access to resources. They are likely to be the last to leave when a natural disaster occurs. And it's also said that whenever we have natural disasters, the mortality rates are higher for women. And I think there's a connection between how women and girls are socialized. A lot of times when you're talking about natural disaster, you have to swim, you have to climb, and that kind of thing. Normally you would associate it with males. So often women are primarily responsible for their family and communities. And when resources become scarce, the burden of this often unpaid care work increases. And we can see this with the coronavirus, the pandemic. Schools are closed, and women, they are now have an added burden of becoming like full-time teachers for their kids. Next. Yes, so I mentioned recently the coronavirus pandemic, and what's been happening is the shadow pandemic. And this is something that's happening rapidly amidst the COVID-19 crisis. And what we know is since the outbreak of COVID-19, emerging data and reports have shown that violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified. And small countries like Guyana and other in the Caribbean were struggling with resources to adequately address violence against women and girls prior to the pandemic. And again, factors include security, health, money worries, cramped living condition, isolation with abusers, and movement restriction. So continue on with the COVID-19, the pandemic that we're all in right now. Out of the 225 COVID task force that have been set up across 137 countries, women only make up 24% of that. And 67% of climate-related decisions, they are currently occupied by men. But what we know is young women are leading the climate action and are key to solving the climate crisis. However, they do remain underrepresented in the leadership roles. So this is, whenever we're talking about the climate crisis, I do tend to, although the crisis is something that's, it's draining, there's a burden placed on especially young people, especially young women. Whenever I talk about solutions, I always talk about the intersectionality of the issues and the intersectional lens that decision makers and leaders have to use when coming up with solutions to climate change and climate injustice. So intersectionality is a framework for conceptualizing a person, group of people, or social problem as affected by a number of discriminatory and disadvantages. It takes into account people overlapping identities and lived experience in order to understand the complexity of prejudice they face. For example, race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and other identity markers. And this intersectionality was first used by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. So this, I have two images here, and they basically give you an idea of when we're talking about intersectionality. There's so much that goes into it. There's so much that a person, how they show up, there's so many things: race, ethnicity, gender, class, religion, all these play a role in intersectionalities and the lens. Yes. So, yes. So as I was saying, the intersectional framework for the climate crisis, it must include, women, but not just a specific kind of women, but all women. And if we're fighting for, gender equality, you're fighting for all women and all the different identity that they bring in. So while linkages between gender-based violence and environmental issues are complex and multi-layered, these threats to human rights and healthy ecosystems are clear because research has shown that ending gender-based violence, promoting gender equality, and protecting the environment can positively contribute to securing a safe, sustainable, and equitable future. And so that's briefly an overview of connecting gender and environmental issues. I have a few resources here that you can use if you're interested in learning more about the topic. The Sprouts and the Mystery of the Flood, it's a recent children's book that was written in Guyana through a youth group, the Guyana Youth Environmental Network, and the Breadfruit Collective in partnership with the Ministry of Health. And it's a book that explains the connection between climate change and health in a very simplified way for children, and it's available for free. And I have here a number of other resources, like, for example, the Climate Conscious Podcast, which is a Caribbean Trinidadian host, Derval. She is from Trinidad. She's currently based in Guyana, but she explores various climate change issues from people living in the Caribbean. I am open to questions, and I know we had another speaker, so while I was planning, I did plan for only 7 minutes, but I know we do have some more time here and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that incredible speech. Again, very interesting topic there, bringing up intersectionality and the link between intersectionality and climate change. Can we all please give Christine Samwaru a huge clap for her presentation and her time this evening, a huge warm Caribbean Links clap. Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you very much, Dr. Thera. We are now going to move on to the audience participation part of the event. And what we are going to do now is we are going to take audience questions and comments for Dr. Thera Edwards and Christine Samwaru. So of course, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to unmute or to post in the chat. I'm going to scroll through and have a look to see if anyone has posted any questions. Well, I am going to pose a question in a few moments. Does anyone have any questions at all? Well, I have a question and it's about the brain drain, because I think that I've noticed that kind of through speaking with other Caribbean people and also through kind of reading literature and history and stuff like that. So I would like to know what can be done to not necessarily, I don't want to say stop the brain drain, but at least lessen the brain drain so that more people who have those skills and that knowledge would feel more compelled to stay in the region, or at least come back more to the region, so that we not have to rely so much on external reports and external kind of contributions.
Well, brain drain is a multi-headed dragon, so to speak, because sometimes it starts very innocuously, where there are persons who want to do specialized training, and so they go to an overseas country, and it doesn't always have to be necessarily the typical US, Canada, UK. Sometimes it might be Japan, or other places in Europe, New Zealand. They go very far afield, and for various reasons they get assimilated into the countries where they go for studies. And then you have the more aggressive brain drain, where persons are targeted, they're headhunted out. So take education. Our teachers are targeted. They are ads, they get immigration help, and they are they go to other countries. One of my best friends from undergraduate days at the University of the West Indies went to the UK just for a year or two, and some 30 years later, 25, 30 years later, she's still there. Just last year, another teacher I knew was, targeted and invited into a position. Nurses, doctors are two other popular professions, but we also have ecologists, economists, and other persons who are attracted into other jobs. And we have to be mindful that climate change isn't only a science thing, because the number crunching might require persons with mathematical skills, modeling, the computer persons. It will require persons who are doing monitoring on the ground to provide data to go into the models. It requires persons who are communicators, who can engage the public to say, these are our findings and this is why you need to be mindful. Now, every time we lose a professional in any of the necessary areas that can be used to promote generation of information, knowledge dissemination, that's an impact. The reality too, again, goes back to our small economies and the resources that, say, the government has to play. There are very few private sector person, organizations, companies that people can work with. So a lot of the persons work within the government, and the government now has, cannot pay competitive salaries. So persons start out in the government as early career professionals, and then when they decide they really want to earn money, then they step away. So that's one dimension of it. And then there is just the sheer sometimes frustration of trying to work without resources. Persons are like, I just can't do this anymore, working on a shoestring, working without a budget, working without equipment. Last year I was doing something and then I saw a data gap and I'm like, what happened here? Oh, the data loggers stopped working. They weren't replaced. So that's now a data gap. And people get frustrated working in a system like that and just sort of give up, and say, I can't do this. And then you just have another dimension in that some islands are just that small. Even with, sixth form, A levels, persons going to universities, and we have, University of the West Indies as a regional university with campuses across an open campus, facilities across the Caribbean. There just are not enough persons who get trained to that next level to become competent to contribute. So there are a few people, even in Jamaica, which is larger than, say, St. Lucia, or, and I'm not trying to say we're a big island. I'm just speaking from experience, no disrespect. I go to meetings and we joke, it's the usual suspects. We actually become a little circle of people because it's always the same. There's a consultation, same people. There's a report to be reviewed, same people. Something to be done, it's the same. It's the same. It's just what it is.
Thank you for that, Dr. Thera. Christine, do you have any further comments before I allow other audience members to ask questions?
Yes. So I'm in a weird position because I actually returned to Guyana, having been away in the States. So I remember that decision to come back. People didn't understand that because usually you leave and you stay, you don't come back. But I do think a lot of person, especially in the diaspora, they are interested in their countries, or they've heard stories from their family and they do want to connect and do work here in the Caribbean. So I really do think that I do like groups like Caribbean Links because it is linking people that's in these countries and people in the diaspora that have skills. And I think that's one way to do it. And I do think opportunities is a big thing, because as young people and even people that migrate out, they're doing that because they want economic gain. And the development of the country is very important, but I think within the countries, there are always so many like political issues. And so that also may drive out the really good people that are, they are looking for better opportunities elsewhere.
Thank you for that, Christine. I believe Theo, I am not sure if the person is still here.
Yes, I am here.
Thank you, Grace.
So my name is Theophina, and I think what Christina was saying especially resonated because I am in the UK currently, and I really discovered Caribbean Links and just want to have more tie back to my heritage country. Both of my parents are from Carriacou. I was born in England, but obviously with both of my parents being from Carriacou, I just wanted to strengthen sort of the understanding of what's happening with groups and people working on the ground in the Caribbean. And I think what's worrying me, I'm not an expert at all, so I've just been avidly listening to everything that's been wonderfully taught about the reefs and about the sensitivity of the coral in the Caribbean. I was reading an article and I'm very scared, and I just wanted to ask what the general consensus was with rising water levels. And I read this very scary article that Caribbean islands could be underwater by 2100. And I just wanted to know what, if that's firstly a reasonable claim, and yeah, what the apparent consensus is with rising water levels and the effects that it'll have on the islands.
So thank you, Theophina, for that question, that observation, what you've been reading. I'm happy that Caribbean Links is there, and what you're saying is very true, because it allows connection, Christine, as well. We can bring minds together. And that was one of the things that Afi and I talked about, was how can people contribute? And, you know, sometimes it's things like skills, like, can you compile reports? Are you good at proposal writing? For instance, my NGO, we are doing everything. It's the same staff members who are out on patrol, crunching numbers, going to meetings, dealing with the banks and signatures and all kinds of admin busy work, are the same ones who have to chase down grants and write proposals. And if there are persons who can help us put documents and proposals together, sometimes just being on the lookout for things. I heard one person say, oh, there was a call for training that closed yesterday, and then somebody said, oh, I saw that came to me several times, but I'm like, did you pass it on? We always want to know about opportunities. So that's one part of what you said. And with regards to the sea level rise, so there's water rising like floods, but then there's also just general sea level rise. It's very real. There are a number of places, say in Jamaica, we've had long-term monitoring at places like St. Margaret's Bay, Anata Bay. We've had places like Hellshire Beach, which is a combination of erosion from, you know, reef breakdown, overtopping. You do have coastlines that are being lost. You have the example I showed of Suriname, where just their low coastal areas are now being inundated. So that's a little bit more pervasive in that it just is a slow onset event. So you have the storm surge, which is rapid onset, and then you have the slow onset, which is the general, you know, millimeter by millimeter rise. So that now moves from adaptation into the kind of construction where we allow persons to construct. It raises issues of water security, because we have what's called saline intrusion of coastal aquifers, where the saline water goes into the aquifers. So instead of pulling up fresh potable water, you're getting salt infused water, which is no longer good for drinking, or even if you were to use it on fields, it could actually scorch your crops because it's just too saline. It's not saline, but the salinity level has increased. So that now takes this changes in terms of policies, development orders. Like if in Jamaica, we have parish development orders that prescribe where development can occur and what type. So we now have to look at zoning. We've had persons who have been cautioned about building in the coastal areas, and they go right ahead, and you pass back some years later, and the back of the structure is totally broken away because the sea has moved on. So persons have to be mindful of building too close to the water line in coastal areas, looking at putting buildings on pillars. They also have to look at being a lot more aggressive about climate action, demanding changes. The COP26 that happened end of last year in Glasgow did not come away with strong enough actions. We know that the actions that were actually agreed to will not let us keep in line with the 1.5 to stay alive that we need. And that says that we need to be a lot more aggressive from wherever we are, individually and in any collective groups, about lobbying for the real change that needs to happen to avert the climate disaster, so to speak.
Thank you so much for that. First of all, thank you, Theophina, for that question. That was really, really an important question to ask. And thank you, Dr. Thera, for that answer. Christine, do you have any further comments to make before I allow another audience member to speak?
I agree with everything Dr. Edwards mentioned, and living in Guyana too, like we see that, you know, we're already a country below sea level, and like I mentioned, our population live along the coast. So climate disaster, when it happens, it has a connection to so many different issues, the health sector, the economic sector, and so forth. I think definitely when it comes to these international conventions, I do think adaptation is such an important thing. And I think in Guyana right now, we're actually at a crossroads because we're also recently now we're developing our oil and gas sector, and we know the fossil fuel industry and the role it plays in climate change. So it's a very interesting dynamics to live in a country that's considered a carbon sink, but also now we will be involved in the fossil fuel industry.
And I don't want to spread, sorry, one more thing. I don't want to spread misinformation. So is this article that's saying that the islands would be underwater correct, or is that more of a projection, would you say?
Not all the islands would be underwater, because some have mountainous centers, but you would have certainly very different coastal outline, so to speak. The island shape would change. The marine geology unit that's in my building at UWI actually had a poster on the wall called Jamaica If the Ice Cap Should Melt. And what it did is, using the predicted sea level rise, looked at 3D models of Jamaica and then adjusted the coastline to follow the new level to show that Jamaica's shape on the map would be very different. So yes, there would be coastal changes. A classic is but we wouldn't be totally lost off the map, so to speak. But it's real. I have a research project in Clarendon, which is on Jamaica's south coast. And there was a fort in the 1700s that was used when Jamaica had the last battle between the French and the British. The French were trying to take Jamaica, and the British were repulsing them. And there was a fort that was right at the edge of land on the beach area. That fort is completely underwater now, completely. No part of it breaks the surface, but you can stand on the top of the walls maybe, and you'd be like knee high on top of the wall of the fort, but the complete fort structure is underwater. So that's, 250 or so years, and that's happened. So the progress is real. The march of sea level rise is real, and it's something that we have to be mindful of. But as I pointed out, some places don't have a lot of flat lands, and certain things you can't do well on slopes. So the coastal areas will always be preferred, but the reality is that they are at risk from loss.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There's another thing. I don't know if I feel there was a question in the chat from Lesline.
Yes.
Right. So
I would just firstly, I believe Andrew wanted to ask a question. Is Andrew still here? I've got a list here I've noticed of people who have either raised a hand or put a question. So is Andrew here to ask a question?
Yes, hello. Thank you, panelists. Very good talk, and very informative. Thank you very much. My question I had was really about further information about the work that both of you do, if you're going to provide some links, if there are any publications that we can read as well.
So the publication that I co-edited, which I feel graciously mentioned in my introduction, that actually follows a series of publications by a professor in my department, David Barker, along with Duncan McGregor, who's based in the UK. He was at Royal Holloway. And they started putting together collections of papers from joint British Caribbean research seminar series. So they've held a number of research seminars between scholars from the UK and the Caribbean and put the outputs into volumes. And those volumes are track the whole advent of climate change, globalization. And the final volume now, which looks at adaptation and resilience, those are available through UE Press. There's one volume, which I'm gonna do some quick checking and post the link, is actually freely available from the UE Press website. So there's that, and I will post the link for the Caribbean Coastal Area Foundation, Management Foundation as well, which is an NGO. But there are so many NGOs in the Caribbean that you can support depending on your interests. So whether you want to support something marine, something that looks at livelihoods, Christine's work with women, you know, it's quite, there's a shopping list, so to speak, of support that you can give, whether in terms of your time and human capacity or through financial contributions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thera, for that answer. Christine, do you have any further comment to make before I move on to the next audience member?
Thank you, Andrew, for the question. So at the end of the presentation, I placed a list and I tried to incorporate Caribbean people who are doing the work. There is, like I mentioned, there's a podcast, there's the UN Caribbean women specifically. So they put out a lot of reports regarding climate change and women within the region. So definitely I can have the presentation share with Afia, and then she can share with her list.
Of course, and I have to say, I have had the pleasure of seeing some of, or looking at some of the things that Christine and Dr. Thera do, and it's just amazing. So I will definitely share. There is another audience member, Hussein. Hussein, would you like to speak?
Hi, good afternoon here from Guyana. I noticed Christine is from Guyana as well. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Doc. I actually have some comments and two questions actually. Number one, I think Christine, well, firstly, Christine, you did a wonderful job there in sharing some information, and so to the other panelists as well. First question is that I think you guys mentioned about the Caribbean link. I was new to this actually. I didn't notice that they had, or observe that they had a Caribbean link for diaspora. Though I attend a few diaspora conferences at the university and others, I was unclear of this link. If you could feel free to share so that others could join, you know, from them to know. And also from my colleague in the UK who is studying now, I know she mentioned of some points there. Yes, the Guyana course is actually currently going, and as the Miss mentioned, Suriname is also the same. The coastal line for both is being what should I say, erosion, a lot of erosion taking place currently. I don't know how fast the government, both governments could assist. I know if Christine, you could share some more of that. SBM, one of their companies, and I think it's NARI, the Government of Guyana agency, and they had some agreements for the mangrove project. So I think that would help in some amount of percentage for climate change. I'm not sure how many, but it's something nice and could be well done with more youths involved. I mean, some of us come up from schools and, you know, we get into college and university and that's it. After that, we go to work. What about the others? I also mentioned in the chapter about CVET and CVET. And then this spoke about from persons who went in overseas and study and, you know, brain drain matters and what's not. I was one of the test specimens for CVET and CVET, so I could, you know, relate to that in the Caribbean actually. It was developed, I think, in Barbados and Grenada. Those are the two countries that is high right now in level 3 and level 4 accreditation. In Guyana is not that much. I think it's level 2 now. They're going to level 3. But I passed way of those stages. I won't do the levels. It would be nice if the society could, I don't know, tap into it and see for some more development into these technical areas where everyone could benefit. As Dr. mentioned, you need people on the ground to gather information and to share from the middle level and the top level so that everyone can actually get to read the report and know how statistics standpoint, if water levels or, we got to know crops, no water, whatever the case is. So I think that's it for my comments. I don't have any more at this point.
Thank you very much, Hussein. Dr. Thera and Christine, do you have any comments in response?
Yes, so I know Hussein, you mentioned the mangrove and Nari. And what I can say is definitely mangroves are the natural solutions to protecting our coasts. And what I do know from working at the EPA is they are working to kind of have a combination of adaptation measures, so not just like seawalls and the hard structure, but including the green aspect and including like regrowth and planting of mangrove, because in some areas mangroves, they actually have a cycle, so sometimes they die off after a few years. So it's like a continuous process of ensuring that the mangroves are protected, and in Guyana they are a protected species, so you're not allowed to like cut down a mangrove or so. So in certain parts of Guyana, they're more vulnerable to flooding and storm surge compared to other areas, and they are trying to have more community engagement. But I always think there is still more work to be done, and definitely involving women in these projects is always a benefit.
Thank you very much, Christine.
I just wanted to say that, like, to pick up from what Christine said, there's been a lot of work into research, like with the Center for Marine Sciences at UWI, into mangrove nurseries, how to actually first propagate mangroves, plant them out to ensure success. They've had some work on the fringes of the Palisados, which I mentioned, of course, is that strip of land that leads to our airport. Because there's a growing awareness about the importance of mangroves in coastal defenses, providing, a nursery area for young fish. And so replanting mangroves has become very important. One of the little tiny thumbnails I showed in my presentation was by the work of the Forestry Department to actually conduct an island-wide assessment of just where the mangroves are and their health and condition. I think I'm trying to make a plug too for the importance of funding data and information, because the data and information give us a snapshot of where we are now. They give us benchmarks. They help put information into models that help us do scenario modeling for future situations. Like there's a report that I need to finish today that's part of work looking at climate models for, again, the 5 sectors, health, agriculture, human settlements, water, tourism, and coastal areas, looking at 150, well, we've used the most extreme instances of 100-year models of extreme weather for hurricane winds, storm surge, hurricane wave heights, temperature, and so on, to look ahead. But we can't build models without data. And what's interesting, when I was talking to a retired 87-year-old professor in the department, is that he did work some years ago doing some projections for coastline change in the Grill. And what he wants to see is what the projections of that time, how they stack up against the actual measurements that we're seeing now. So if we never did the work back then, we wouldn't have any comparators. And then when we do the comparators, then we can refine the models to say, well, this would make the model actually fit the data and do the refining work. So just a plug that the science needs to happen, the measurements need to happen as well. So just to throw that in.
Apologies, Dr. Thira, and thank you very much for that very detailed response. Thank you. There's now another audience member, Leslie. Leslie, would you like to speak?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Dr. Edwards, for your really interesting talks. My interest was when you were talking about the storms and the extra water that was coming up over the islands, and at the same time you have droughts happening. And so I am wondering, because most, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of the farming and those types of industries are still very small scale. So I don't think that they have the means to invest in water tables and things that could capture the water. And so I'm interested to know what kind of precautions or investments is the government making to actually help contain or recycle the excessive water that the islands experience, that would help the agriculture in terms of the drought periods that they experience?
Okay, as usual, it's not ever a simple answer. So one, we have increased population, which means more demand on water. With regards to agriculture, we do rely heavily on rain-fed agriculture. Some of that is not only just increasing water storage, but also we're looking a lot at climate smart agriculture, which includes what we call crop suitability. So it makes no sense putting in a crop which needs a lot of water when you are in an area where there isn't a lot of water or you don't have access to irrigation. So that's one of the things we're trying to work with farmers, is looking at crop suitability, or when you plant a crop so that you have better access to the water. That said, there is climate variability when even with the best of intentions, and we, like in Jamaica where we have a bimodal rainfall with 2 rainy seasons and so on, the seasonality gets disrupted and it doesn't quite happen as you predicted. Water storage, some farmers are putting in tanks to have small amounts of water that they can do targeted irrigation. We are encouraging things like drip irrigation, where the water gets delivered to the root of individual plants versus broadcast overhead, with the sort of a sprinkler going across the field, or flood irrigation, where the field is flooded and soaked out, and then there's no water and it's flooded again in another number of days. But drip irrigation, which requires running hoses, so it's more targeted, or in some instances you can put in the fertilizer and deliver it more efficiently. The other problem too is when you have these high rainfall events, the water is coming forcibly. In some river systems, it's picking up sediment, so it's quite muddy. And there have been instances where the water authorities have had to shut down the intakes because it's so heavily silted, it would damage their equipment. The grit and the sand and other material, the soil that's in the water, would overwhelm their filtration systems, and they shut down the intakes because they just can't take it in. So that's another problem of those high intensity events. So we do encourage local rainwater harvesting, whether it be roofs. Some places in Manchester and so on, you'll see them concreting slopes, and the water gets channeled down to a tank that stores the water for that farm/home system. So those are some of the issues. The other thing that's for a more urban context is that the National Water Commission has embarked on a leak detection program, because one of the biggest problems is loss of water within the system. Not that the system doesn't have water coming in, but during its distribution, it gets lost. So they've invested a lot in leak detection to more efficiently use what they do collect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thera. Christine, do you have any further comments to make?
No, I think Dr. Edwards answered perfectly. Similarly, in Guyana, we are approaching the smart agriculture technique, and I do agree with what she said with the rain harvesting and persons. I think these ancestral practices of having like barrels out and collecting rainwater and so forth, these are still practices that people have in Guyana. But the thing is about climate change, it's so hard to predict because earlier last year, we had intense flooding whereby like entire homes and so forth were flooded. So even though you have an area that's you're experiencing flood, like you can also have other parts of the country where you have extreme droughts as well, because again, climate change is this thing it's so hard to predict, and the weather and the overall climate is being disturbed at alarming rates.
Thank you for that, Christine. I'm now going to ask, I've got another comment or question from an audience member. How is the seawall building and boulders being dumped on the seashore to protect against climate change? How would that affect the biodiversity of countries?
Okay, so yes, some of these coastline areas may have small benthic organisms on the coastline. But if you will note that those coastal protection structures are usually in heavily altered human areas, such as like port facilities, fisheries complexes on the coast. For Jamaica, we had to make there was a lot of outcry by the environmental groups when they decided to do the work on the Palisados Road. But we had to look at the fact that our major international airport, or one of our two large international airports, not like there's one in St. Anne, and the name will come back to me, but there's one on the north coast near Aracabessa, which only takes small jets. But in terms of large jets, there's just the Norman Manley Airport, which is at the end of which is along the Palisados, and there is Sangster in Montego Bay. So we had to look at our access to airspace and international transport versus the environmental costs. And the decision was taken because there were a number of times where that road was actually underwater and you could not get access to the airport. So the decision was taken to raise the road, to build up and raise the road, and they dumped large limestone boulders on the windward or outer harbor side of that. For the inner harbor side of the Palisados, they have been doing some mangrove replanting to reestablish the mangrove coverage, and also hopefully then get back some seagrass as well. The question is so that there will be a biodiversity impact, but sometimes, as always in the environmental field, you have to do the balancing act between development and environment. And there are instances when you have to look at the development gains. And in this case, we were protecting our access to our airport. So there is that. But there are sometimes positive impacts, because you can have high impact wave energy that will rush in and destroy coastal ecosystems, where with the boulder or the artificial protection, you have the breaking of the wave energy, making it less destructive to those coastal ecosystems. So as usual, it's never quite black, white. We have to look at the shades of gray in between. While I have the floor, I just also want to mention something else that we've been doing that is not all doom and gloom. Is there has been a lot of work with growing artificial reefs or cultivation of small bits of coral and planting out corals to aid in reef generation. So there's been quite a lot of success with that kind of work and those systems, or artificial reefs that you can then get some increase in reef coverage. So it's not always loss and damage. There have been some successes in terms of new systems, replenishing, restoration work in these ecosystem areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thea. I just realized I was on mute. Thank you very much for that. Christine, do you have any further comments?
Yeah, it's definitely whenever it comes to the environment and development, there's always the gray area of policy making. And I do think the environmental social impact assessment, ESIA, the tool, I think it's so important to assess our ecosystems and see what's out there, and, you know, kind of have a framework of what you're working with, because in certain places, the kind of organism that live in that particular area may be endemic. So a lot of times when it comes to development, you really have to push governments and make sure that, you know, NGOs are keeping on their toes, so to speak, of what's happening in the country regarding development, because definitely we don't want to prevent development, but we want to do it in a way that's sustainable and that's thinking about the future and the future impact that these development can have.
Thanks for that, Christine. I never kind of thought about that in that way, so thank you. There is another audience member, I believe. Prince, would you like to speak?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, so I should probably provide some context. So I'm a young Barbudan. I grew up there and I moved to the UK. But, you know, I'm very well connected. I still go back, you know, most years. My family all still live out there. But my question really was around, is there sort of an integrated model? So in the UK, I work as a flood risk manager from fluvial, so river flooding, and pluvial surface water flooding, so the rain. And we use integrated catchment models to predict where flooding is going to happen. So I was just wondering, what is there in the Caribbean? Is there sort of a coastal model that has been done for all of the islands? Or, you know, are we currently working with sort of individual countries? Just to really understand where we are, because Barbuda, as I put in my comment, the highest elevation is 43 meters. So sea level rise is something that is, you know, is a big concern, and we're already seeing impact of it from like the Hurricane Irma in 2017. And there's, you know, bits of sand spits that are being just eroded away. So yeah, just to put that one out there.
Right, so thank you very much, Prince. I've actually posted 3 links in the chat, which are visible to everyone in response to your question. So there have been quite a few studies that have looked at the region and some modeling that has been done for the region. In fact, the World Bank Group has a climate change knowledge portal, which then breaks down things country by country. And you can then investigate, say, Antigua and Barbuda as a country, but it's based on generalized modeling and then down sampled to the individual country level. So yes, it's been looked at in very different ways, from the actual what it's going to be like physically to what are the economic and human impacts of this. And I can appreciate, because I've been to Barbuda, just how nervous you are, because it is very vulnerable, not only to sea level rise, but as you mentioned, say with a hurricane, because there is very little vertical relief. There is nothing to break the storm as it, you know, goes over the island, and so you get that sort of to be, hate to say this, but almost like a flattening, you know, utter destruction from the impacts of it. So it is one of our more vulnerable island states, and really a cause for concern. But to answer your main question is, yes, there has been a regional outlook at this issue.
Thank you very
much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Theron. Thank you, Prince. Does anyone have any further questions? As I have a question, does anyone else have any further questions they'd like to ask before I ask mine? Okay, well, mine was about intersectionality, because I know that that has been discussed, but I just wanted to know specifically, especially because I would be interested in doing an event on Indigenous Caribbean tribes. And I would like to know specifically how climate change has affected, if at all, the Indigenous communities within the region.
So in Guyana, I think compared to other Caribbean countries, we have 9 Indigenous groups, and we, as a people in Guyana, we do value traditional knowledge and traditional practices, but also within those communities, they have been impacted by climate change impacts, whether it's droughts and flood, and also their impacted through like their water sources from like mining activities and so forth. However, on the other side of that, Indigenous groups and Indigenous people, they do offer traditional wisdom on how they've been living and ways they've been living with nature and using nature sustainably.
Thank you very much for that, Christine. I'm sure we have a lot to learn. Does anyone have any further questions at all? Or any further questions or comments? If not, I have to say this has just been brilliant. I myself will be watching this over again to make further notes, because the knowledge that has been shared from both Dr. Thera and Christine has just been incredible. If no one has any further questions, I will announce the end of the event. I can see a further comment, but yes, it doesn't appear that anyone has any further questions. So I will now announce the end of the event. Firstly, I would like to thank our panelists for kindly agreeing to speak on the panel. Christine and Dr. Thera Edwards, thank you so much, and Khadija as well. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak on the panel. It's just been brilliant. It's been incredible. All of the knowledge that has been shared. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you. I would like to thank the Caribbean Links team for all their help, participation, support, and incredible hard work. I don't do this by myself. I am very, very privileged to have an amazing team that I work with. Finally, I would like to thank all of the guests, you, the audience, for tuning in. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some of your Saturday afternoon with us. It is greatly appreciated, and we hope to welcome you for our future events. I would ask you all to please follow Caribbean Links on Instagram and Twitter @LinksCaribbean. Please do follow us, we would greatly appreciate that. And also, please could you subscribe to our Caribbean Links YouTube channel, Caribbean Links. If you just type that in, you should be able to find us. So we would greatly appreciate that. Just to let you know that our next virtual event will be on Indigenous Caribbean tribes, and we are really looking forward to having that discussion. I can see that there have been there are comments being put there, so thank you so much for that. But that is the end of the event. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been an absolute privilege and an honor, Dr. Edwards and Christine, to hear from you this evening. I hope that you all have a lovely evening, and I hope that we are able to have many, many more conversations like this. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and have a lovely weekend, and see you next time at our next event. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.